The letter arrived on a damp autumn morning, its ink smudged but its message clear. Two children spoke only to each other. I felt the pull of Wales like a summons, though I could not yet name the shadow waiting for me there. It was the spring of 1978 when the letter arrived, pressed flat between envelopes of bills and medical journals. I remember the day with an unusual clarity, the kind of memory that refuses to soften with time. The sky over London had been low and grey, drizzle collecting in streaks down my study window. I had settled into what I thought would be another uneventful evening of paperwork when I saw the familiar handwriting across the envelope. Dr. Alan Hughes, an old colleague from my early days of practice. His script was hurried, not the steady, careful penmanship I remembered, and already that told me his message would not be a casual invitation. Inside, the letter was brief, almost cryptic. He wrote of two sisters in Haverfordwest, identical twins of West Indian descent, who had, for reasons beyond his comprehension, withdrawn into a language of their own invention. They would not speak to their parents, their teachers, nor to Hughes himself. To the outside world, they were mute, unyielding. Yet, when left alone together, their room filled with a rapid-fire exchange fluid, intricate and utterly unintelligible. It is not babble, Hughes insisted. It is structured, purposeful, as though it belongs to some hidden nation of their making. I confess, my friend, it unsettles me. I find myself questioning the boundaries of pathology and the supernatural. I beg of you, come to Wales at once. I laid the letter on my desk, staring at it for a long while. In nearly 3 decades of documenting peculiar medical cases, I had encountered my share of the inexplicable. Patients who bled without wound, children who convulsed in rhythms resembling prayer, and the girl in Devon whose sleepwalking led her miles from home each night. But never had I read of something so unnerving in its simplicity: two children who spoke, but only to each other. Silence for the world, language for themselves. The rational part of me considered Hughes' description through the lens of science. Cryptophagia, the phenomenon of twins creating private languages, was not unknown, though rarely documented in such absolute form. Yet even in cases of twin speech, there was usually some permeability, fragments of the mother tongue woven through, glimpses of comprehension for outsiders. But Hughes's account spoke of something impenetrable, a wall built between the girls and everyone else, a fortress that allowed no translation. What disturbed me more was the tone of his words. Alan Hughes was not a man easily shaken. He had worked alongside me during the cholera outbreak of '63, standing unflinching in the face of contagion and death. For him to write of being unsettled suggested that what he had witnessed in those girls was not merely medical, but something that pressed against the edges of the explainable. That night I paced my study, the rain outside thickening into a steady downpour. I told myself that I was too old for wild goose chases, that I had responsibilities in London, patients who depended on me. And yet, as the clock hands crept toward midnight, I felt a restlessness I could not quiet. I kept hearing Hughes' phrase, structured, purposeful, and imagined the voices of the twins, weaving patterns beyond comprehension. It was as if some unseen hand was already pulling me westward. By morning, my decision was made. I penned a short reply, informing Hughes that I would arrive within the week. I arranged my practice to run in my absence, packed a small case, and purchased a train ticket to Wales. I remember, as the train pulled out of Paddington, the city sliding away behind me, I felt the same mingling of dread and anticipation I had known only once before when I first set foot in Willow Creek, Alabama. Many years earlier, I could not have known then that the story of those twins would come to haunt me with equal measure, not for what I discovered about them, but for what I could never hope to understand. The call to Wales had been made, and I had answered. What awaited me in that slate-colored town on the edge of the sea would draw me into a mystery, not merely of medicine, but of language, of identity, and of the terrible price two young girls would one day pay for sharing a voice the world could not hear. The train carried me deeper into the Welsh countryside, each mile drawing me further from the ordered bustle of London and into a landscape that seemed perpetually suspended between shadow and silence. It was late afternoon when the iron wheels finally screeched against the platform at Haverfordwest, a modest station of weathered brick and peeling paint. The air that greeted me as I stepped down was sharp and damp, carrying with it the faint tang of salt from the sea miles away. Overhead, the sky stretched low and oppressive, an endless slate-gray sheet that seemed to press upon the town itself. The streets beyond the station were narrow, cobbled, and half-deserted. A few shop fronts leaned wearily into one another, their windows fogged with condensation, displays of bread or newspapers dulled by the moisture clinging to the glass. The wind swept through the alleys with a restless persistence, carrying with it scraps of gossip that clung to the corners of every public house and bus stop. There was a weight to the place, an atmosphere of anticipation, as though the whole town was waiting for something unnamed yet inevitable. I found lodging in a small inn run by a gray-haired woman whose eyes lingered upon me longer than politeness demanded. She asked no questions of my business, yet her gaze seemed to suggest she already knew. It was not until she placed the key in my hand and leaned in, her voice scarcely above a whisper, that she confirmed my suspicion. "You've come about the twins, haven't you?" The words slipped out as though against her better judgment, quickly followed by a glance over her shoulder toward the empty corridor. It was the first time I heard them spoken of directly like the twins. She said no more, retreating behind her reception desk with a stiffness that told me further inquiries would be unwelcome. Yet her single utterance carried a chill that followed me up the narrow stairs to my room. That evening I ventured into town, walking slowly through streets lit by the dim glow of sodium lamps. The people of Haverfordwest were not unfriendly, yet there was a guardedness in their eyes when they marked me as a stranger. Conversations quieted as I passed, only to resume in hushed tones once I had moved on. In a small tavern near the edge of town, I overheard the phrase again. Two men at the bar spoke of the silent twins, their words punctuated by uneasy laughter, as though speaking of them too openly might conjure something best left alone. One of the men noticed my attention and quickly turned his body, shielding his face from my view. I was struck by the consistency of it, the way every mention of the girls carried the same cadence of secrecy and fear. Not open hostility, but something closer to dread disguised as casual remark. It reminded me of how isolated communities once spoke of illness, not as a matter of infection or treatment, but as a curse, a thing brought upon a family by fate or sin. Returning to the inn, I stood for a long while at the window of my small room, watching the town sink into night. The wind rattled the panes, carrying with it the distant sound of church bells. Somewhere in that town, Hughes had written, two girls sat in silence before the world, yet spoke fluently in the shadows of their own making. The thought of them alive, intelligent, and locked within a fortress of words meant for no one else filled me with both anticipation and unease. Sleep did not come easily that night. Instead, I lay awake listening to the creaks of the old building, the low murmur of voices from the street, and above it all the insistent whisper of the wind across the moors. As though the very land itself was trying to tell me something about the place I had entered. It was not yet clear to me, but I felt, in that slate-colored town, I was already caught within a story that stretched far beyond medicine, into the realm of myth and mystery that Wales seemed to carry in its very bones. The next morning brought no sunshine, only a pale light that struggled through the gauze of clouds rolling low over the town. I met Dr. Rave Hughes outside the inn, his expression drawn and serious, though he tried at first to mask it with a smile of greeting. He wasted little time on pleasantries and insisted we walk, leading me through a series of winding streets that eventually gave way to a modest housing estate on the outskirts of town. The buildings were plain, their paint chipped by years of damp winds, their windows curtained against the gray. It was here, Hughes explained, that the family lived. The Grants, immigrants from the Caribbean who had come to Wales in search of work and stability, only to find themselves swallowed by isolation. The Grants' home was small, pressed tightly between two others in a row of identical houses. A thin garden out front struggled with weeds, its patchy grass beaten flat by rain. Hughes knocked, and after a pause the door opened to reveal a woman whose face bore the fatigue of many sleepless nights. This was Gloria Grant, the twins' mother. Her eyes were dark and wary, but there was a gentleness in them too, the kind that comes from carrying burdens silently for too long. She welcomed us in with quiet politeness, though her voice carried the accent of her island home, softened by years in Britain. Inside, the house was orderly but worn. A single electric heater hummed in the corner, fighting a losing battle against the chill that crept through the walls. On the mantel stood a few family photographs, most of them faded children in school uniforms, a young couple on their wedding day, all smiling with the kind of hope that had since been eroded by disappointment. Gloria motioned us to sit in the front room, and soon her husband joined us. Aubrey Grant was a man of few words, his frame bent slightly from long years of labor at the local air base. His handshake was firm, but his eyes betrayed the same exhaustion as his wife's, as though the life had been drained from him in increments too small to notice until nothing remained. When Hughes introduced me, explaining my interest in the twins, both parents exchanged a look I could not quite read. It was not suspicion, but something closer to resignation, as though they had repeated this routine before welcoming yet another professional into their home, offering the same explanations, only to watch him leave with nothing solved. Gloria began to speak of her daughters, June and Jennifer, describing them as bright children in their earliest years, playful and affectionate, if a little shy. But as they grew older, something shifted. Their laughter and chatter, once directed to family and friends, turned inward until it was reserved solely for one another. "They shut us out," Gloria said softly, twisting her hands in her lap. "It's like we don't exist to them. They look at us but don't see us. They talk all the time, but only to each other, in that language." She faltered, as though the word itself carried a weight she could not lift. Aubrey spoke then, his voice low and rough. "We've tried everything. Teachers, pastors, doctors. Nothing makes a difference. If you keep them apart, they stop eating, stop moving. Like they'd rather die than be without each other. And when they're together, it's like—" He shook his head and fell silent, staring at the floor. I asked if I might see the twins, but Gloria hesitated. "They don't take kindly to strangers," she said, her voice almost apologetic. "And I won't force them. They'll know you're here soon enough. They always know." As she spoke, I felt an odd pressure in the room, as if the very walls carried the strain of their daughter's silence. This was not simply the burden of raising difficult children. It was the weight of a mystery too large for one household, pressing down upon two weary parents who had long since surrendered hope of answers. Sitting in that small front room, with the damp seeping through the wallpaper and the tired faces of Gloria and Aubrey across from me, I realized that the true tragedy of the twins was not confined to their own strange isolation, but had spread outward like a shadow, swallowing their family in quiet despair. It was late afternoon when Hughes told me the twins were home from school. We had spent the earlier hours speaking with their parents in the small, dimly lit front room, the air heavy with the smell of tea and damp wool. Gloria had kept glancing toward the hallway as if awaiting the inevitable moment, while Aubrey remained silent, his gaze fixed on the floor. When Hughes suggested that I finally meet the girls, both parents tensed, though they offered no objection. The corridor that led to their bedroom was narrow, its wallpaper faded, its carpet threadbare. I remember the creak of the floorboards under our steps, a sound that seemed far too loud in that hushed house. At the end of the hall, a closed door waited. Hughes paused before it, listening, then gave a small nod. Faint sounds trickled through the wood-quick rhythmic syllables, spoken so fast they almost seemed like the clatter of sewing needles. It was not English, nor any language I recognized, though its cadence carried a strange precision. He knocked gently. The voices ceased at once. Silence fell so abruptly, it felt like a breath sucked out of the air. When the door opened, it was not by their choice, but by Gloria's, who called their names softly before stepping inside. I followed, careful not to intrude too quickly. The room was small and neat, with twin beds pressed against opposite walls, their covers patterned with faded florals. A few books lay scattered across the floor, their pages worn from use. Near the window, two identical figures sat close together, knees drawn up, their heads bowed as though caught in the act of conspiring. They lifted their faces to me at the same time. I was struck by how utterly alike they were, mirror images down to the arch of their brows, the shape of their lips, the curious stillness in their eyes. June and Jennifer. Their gazes held mine for a moment, unblinking, before sliding back toward each other as if drawn by some invisible thread. Neither spoke. Instead, I heard the faintest murmur, words pressed between their lips in quick succession, too low to discern. I introduced myself as gently as I could, explaining that I was a doctor and had come to help. My voice seemed to vanish in the room, swallowed by their silence. They did not reply, did not so much as nod. Only a flicker of expression passed between Themen's almost imperceptible curve at the corner of one mouth, answered by the other. It was communication, unmistakably so, but meant for no one else. I tried again, asking if they enjoyed their lessons, if they liked to read. Still, no response. Their bodies remained perfectly still, save for the occasional shift of their eyes, darting back and forth as though words were racing silently between them faster than I could ever follow. Then, as if testing me, they let slip a few murmured sounds, a staccato exchange so fluid it might have been rehearsed for years. The syllables were clipped and foreign, with a rhythm that reminded me faintly of Caribbean speech patterns, yet twisted into something entirely their own. It was clear I was not part of their world. I was only an intruder, a man standing in a doorway, while the true conversation flowed in an undercurrent invisible to me. The sensation was profoundly unsettling, like watching shadows move on a wall without knowing what cast them. After several minutes of silence broken only by their murmurs, Gloria laid a hand on my arm and shook her head gently, signaling it was enough. I inclined my head in understanding, though my heart was heavy. I had come prepared for difficulty, but nothing had prepared me for that uncanny stillness, that unwavering refusal to engage with anyone beyond their twin bond. As we withdrew from the room, the door closing softly behind us, the murmuring resumed at once, as though my presence had been nothing more than a passing interruption. In that moment, I realized the truth of Hughes's words. These were not merely shy children or stubborn adolescents. They were two minds sealed within a private chamber, a fortress of speech so impenetrable that the rest of the world family, teachers, physicians, were left stranded outside. I felt the first stirrings of unease, for I understood then that whatever bound June and Jennifer together was not something easily studied or undone. It was something deeper, something that defied the simple instruments of science, and it had just looked me directly in the eyes. I began my study of their speech the following week, armed with nothing more than a small portable tape recorder and the kind of patience one acquires after years of tending to difficult patients. Hughes arranged for me to spend several hours in the Grant household, though the twins were not told of my purpose directly. Gloria, hesitant but hopeful, allowed me to sit quietly in their room while they occupied themselves as they usually did, her only request being that I try not to unsettle them with too many questions. At first, they ignored me entirely. The two girls sat cross-legged on one of the narrow beds, their shoulders nearly touching, heads bent over a dog-eared magazine they scarcely pretended to read. Their eyes darted occasionally to the recorder on my lap, its red light blinking steadily, but they betrayed no sign of curiosity or alarm. For nearly half an hour they remained still, whispering in tones too low for the machine to catch. It was only when I shifted my chair slightly, scraping the wooden floor, that they seemed to relent. As if in defiance of my intrusion, they began to speak in earnest. What poured forth was unlike anything I had ever heard. Their voices intertwined in rapid-fire bursts, each girl answering the other with no pause for thought, no space for hesitation. The cadence was hypnotic, quick, percussive, a rhythm that reminded me of drumming patterns I had once heard in the Caribbean, layered with the sing-song rise and fall of Welsh accented English. Yet it was neither Welsh nor English, nor entirely Creole. There were fragments I thought I recognized, syllables that flickered with meaning only to dissolve into the unfamiliar. I listened with rapt attention, my pen scratching furiously across the page as I attempted to capture the flow of their dialogue. But transcription was futile. Their language was too swift, too fluid, a tide that carried meaning away before my pen could catch it. When I played back the recording later that night, I found myself both exhilarated and unnerved. It was not gibberish. There was structure, repetition, even grammar of a kind. Certain words or sounds recurred in specific places, markers of tense or emphasis, though I could not discern their function. It was a system, a creation born entirely between them. More troubling still was the way their voices altered in concert. When one grew louder, the other softened. When one quickened, the other slowed, as though compensating to maintain a perfect balance. At times, they spoke so closely in unison that their voices merged into a single sound, eerie and otherworldly, like an echo produced without delay. I found myself wondering if I was hearing two separate minds, or one consciousness split across two bodies. When I attempted to engage them asking what certain words meant, or if they might repeat a phrase from me, they withdrew at once. Their eyes narrowed, their speech fell into silence, and the invisible wall rose again between us. The more I pressed, the more they seemed to retreat, until finally they sat mute, arms folded, faces expressionless. It was Hughes who later advised me against direct questioning. "They guard it," he said. "That language is their fortress. They'll never surrender it on command." And yet, the longer I observed them, the more I became convinced they were not merely playing with words as children sometimes do. This was not the secret code of mischievous siblings hiding gossip from their parents. It was more deliberate, more profound. Their language was a world they inhabited together, complete with rules and rhythms no outsider could penetrate. To ask them to translate was to ask them to betray the very foundation of their existence. Late one evening, after reviewing the recordings for the third time, I set my pen down and stared at the spools of tape. The voices that spun from them were young, girlish, yet there was something in their tone that felt ancient, as though the twins had tapped into a current of speech older than themselves. I could not explain it, nor could I dismiss it. Instead, I found myself listening over and over, caught in the patterns of their invented tongue, half hoping for meaning, half dreading what I might uncover if meaning revealed itself. The Grants' daughters had built a citadel of words, a place where no one else could follow, and I, trained in science, armed with observation, was left standing at the gates, recording the shadows of voices that refused to let me in. It was through their teachers that I first began to understand the full scope of June and Jennifer's withdrawal from the world. Hughes arranged for me to visit the school where the girls were enrolled, a low, squat building on the edge of town that bore the weary look of an institution accustomed to disappointment. The headmistress, a severe woman with iron-gray hair, received me in her office and spoke with the tone of someone long past her patience. "They do not belong here," she said, pushing her spectacles higher on the bridge of her nose. "Not because they are unintelligent, quite the opposite, in fact, but because they refuse to participate in anything that requires even the smallest shred of human exchange." I asked for examples, and she obliged with more detail than I expected. From their earliest days at the school, the twins had resisted every attempt to draw them into the classroom rhythm. They would sit at their desks in complete silence, eyes lowered, hands folded neatly before them, as though carved of wax. Lessons passed without so much as a whispered word. No matter what the teacher asked, simple arithmetic, reading aloud, Even their names there was never a response. Hours might pass with the two of them motionless, staring at their books but never turning a page. Their stillness unsettled the other children, who began to edge their desks away, whispering among themselves about the strange sisters. One teacher, a younger man fresh from university, had once attempted a more forceful approach. He stood over June, demanding that she read from the board, his voice rising with frustration. She stared at him with wide, unblinking eyes, lips pressed tightly shut. Jennifer mirrored her, every motion identical. The silence stretched until the man, red-faced and defeated, moved on to another pupil. "It is as though they feed off each other," the headmistress said, her expression dark. "So long as one remains silent, the other will follow. Nothing we do can break the spell." Yet there was another side to them, one the teachers witnessed only by accident. When the school day ended and the corridors emptied, sometimes a staff member lingering late would pass by the playground and hear voices fast, fluid, alive. The twins would be there, utterly transformed, racing after one another with shrieks of laughter, speaking their secret tongue in bright, cascading streams. But the instant an adult stepped into view, their energy died. They froze mid-motion, their eyes falling to the ground, their lips sealed once more. It was like watching candles snuffed by a sudden wind. Even within their own household, the pattern held. Gloria confided to me one evening that their brothers and sisters were excluded from the strange world the twins inhabited. At family meals, June and Jennifer sat shoulder to shoulder, speaking not a word, ignoring the chatter around them. If a sibling tried to draw them in asking about school, sharing a joke, twins responded with blank stares, their faces drained of expression. Yet once dismissed from the table, they hurried off together, whispering urgently the moment they reached the safety of their room. Their siblings, once merely confused, had grown resentful, even fearful. "They don't want us," one of the younger brothers reportedly said. "They only want each other." The isolation was not simply habit, it had hardened into ritual. The twins lived in two states: absolute silence before the world, and fierce, unbroken conversation when alone together. That rigid duality frightened me more than I cared to admit. It suggested not mere shyness, nor even defiance, but a deliberate withdrawal into a private reality of their own making. They had chosen the fortress, brick by brick, until no door remained for anyone else to enter. As I left the school that day, the headmistress's words echoed in my mind. "They do not belong here." I understood her frustration, yet I also felt an undercurrent of dread. If they did not belong here among their classmates, their family, their community, where did they belong? And what sort of world were they constructing in the shadows, sustained only by their mirrored voices that no one else could touch? It was on a damp afternoon, the kind where the sky seemed to sag under the weight of unfallen rain, that I was summoned to the office of the school counselor. He was a nervous man, his thin frame hunched as though perpetually bracing against some unseen wind. He greeted me with a hesitant handshake and, after a moment's pause, locked the door behind us. From the top drawer of his desk, he withdrew a small notebook, its cover scuffed, its edges softened by use. He held it in both hands as though it were a fragile relic rather than a child's possession. "We aren't supposed to keep these," he whispered, glancing toward the door though no one was near. "The girls hide them, bury them in the garden, or wedge them between the slats of their bed. This one was discovered accidentally. I shouldn't be showing you, but—" He faltered, then pushed it across the desk toward me. "Read, you'll see." The handwriting that filled the pages was neat, but pressed hard into the paper, as though the pen had been gripped with unusual force. At first, I expected childish scrawls or fanciful doodles, but what I found was something else entirely. The entries were written in English, surprisingly fluent, though interspersed with words that seemed borrowed from their private language, left untranslated as if no equivalent existed. I read of kingdoms ruled by merciless queens, of servants forced into obedience, of punishments meted out with chilling delight. One passage described a neighbor's dog locked in a shed, its cries recorded with detached fascination, as though suffering were a specimen to be examined, rather than a thing to pity. Another told of a girl unnamed, though the details suggested one of their own classmates falling into disgrace, humiliated before a crowd, her shame savored in precise, cruel sentences. It was not only the content that unsettled me, but the sophistication of the prose. These were not idle scribbles, they were narratives, carefully structured, heavy with imagery. Her tears were like pearls, one entry read, falling into my hands, and I crushed them until nothing remained. The voice was at once childlike and ancient, a strange merging of innocence and something far darker. I looked up from the pages, unsettled, and found the counselor watching me with wide, uneasy eyes. "Do you see?" he asked. "They are not like other children. There is something in them, something I don't understand." I turned back to the notebook, scanning further. Interwoven with the fantasies were reflections on the twins' own existence, cryptic remarks about being two bodies but one soul, about living in mirrors, about a fate that demanded sacrifice. "If one of us dies," one line read starkly, "the other will live truly, but which?" I closed the book, my hand lingering on the cover as though reluctant to let go of its unsettling weight. These were not merely the private amusements of imaginative girls. They were windows into a shared mind that pulsed with obsession, power, and an undercurrent of violence. It struck me then that their silence in the world outside was not emptiness, but containment, a dam holding back currents too strong for ordinary life. When they wrote, the dam cracked, and what poured forth was raw, unfiltered, and dangerous. The counselor leaned forward, lowering his voice further. "We don't confront them about the journals. The last time we tried, Jennifer went rigid, wouldn't eat for days. June sat by her side the whole time, whispering in that language, like some kind of incantation. When Jennifer finally moved again, she tore the diary into pieces and burned it in the playground bin. They guard these words like treasure." I handed the notebook back, though reluctantly. "May I ask," I said slowly, "whose diary? This is June's, or Jennifer's?" The counselor shook his head. "That's the question, isn't it? We can never tell. Their handwriting is the same. Their thoughts echo one another. Sometimes I wonder if even they know the difference." As I left his office, the gray skies above seemed darker still, pressing down upon the schoolyard where the twins lingered apart from their peers, two slender figures whispering in perfect synchrony. I could not look at them the same way again. The silence they kept was no longer simply the stillness of shy children. It was the hush of a secret world, one written in words sharp enough to wound, and I feared I had only glimpsed its edge. The first true attempt to break the pattern came at the urging of the school board. By 1979, the twins had become something of a spectacle among the staff, two bright-eyed girls who would not utter a single word to teachers or classmates, whose grades slipped further with each passing term, whose presence in the classroom had begun to unsettle the other children. The headmistress argued that professional help was needed, and soon a speech therapist from Cardiff was brought in. I was invited to observe one of the sessions. The therapist, a patient woman with a calm voice, greeted the girls warmly as they sat stiffly across from her. She placed picture cards on the table, simple drawings of animals and objects, inviting them to point, to name, to say anything at all. At first, the twins sat motionless, their eyes cast downward, lips pressed tight. Then, after several long minutes, they turned toward each other. Their mouths began to move, quick and low, that same secretive murmur. The therapist encouraged them gently. "Yes, talk to me. Tell me what you see." But they did not turn their faces to her. Their words flowed between themselves, ignoring the cards, ignoring the adult who leaned closer with hopeful persistence. This pattern repeated itself for weeks. The therapist tried games, songs, even puppets, but each attempt fell against the wall of their silence. At times, she caught them laughing together in their strange tongue, but the moment she attempted to join in, they froze like startled deer. Their silence became almost militant, a refusal so complete it bordered on defiance. It was not that they could not speak, they had voices, as their private language proved it was that they would not for anyone beyond themselves. Frustration gave way to desperation, and the authorities decided upon a harsher measure. Perhaps, they reasoned, if the twins were separated, forced to interact with others, they might finally be drawn into the ordinary world. Arrangements were made to send June to one school and Jennifer to another, several miles apart. Gloria wept when she was told, but Aubrey, weary and resigned, agreed to comply. The family could do little else against the weight of official insistence. The result was catastrophic. I visited each girl in her respective school during that period, and what I found was nothing short of alarming. Without her sister, each twin became a husk of herself. They did not speak to classmates or teachers, as expected, but worse, they barely moved at all. Hours passed with them slumped at their desks, their eyes fixed on nothing, their bodies slack, as though the animating spirit had been drained away. They refused food, pushing trays aside untouched. They would not read, would not write, would not even turn their heads when addressed. Nurses reported that their weight began to drop alarmingly in just a few weeks. One afternoon, I sat beside June in the infirmary. She lay on the bed, thin and motionless, her pulse weak beneath my fingers. When I spoke her name, there was no flicker of recognition. It was as though she had folded herself inward, retreating to a place beyond reach. Jennifer, I was told, was in the same state across town. The experiment lasted barely 2 months before the authorities relented. Their health was deteriorating too rapidly, their catatonia too profound. They were reunited at home one Friday evening, and what followed defied all logic. Within hours, the transformation was astonishing. Their bodies regained a restless energy, their eyes lit with a spark that had been absent for weeks. By morning they were speaking again in that rapid, secret language, as fluid as ever, feeding one another with a vitality that had returned the instant their separation ended. I recall standing in the Grants' small living room that weekend, watching the girls chatter to one another, their voices cascading like twin streams. It was impossible to reconcile them with the vacant creatures I had seen only days before. Hughes turned to me then, his face grim. "Do you see? They cannot survive without each other. Whatever world they've built, they can only live inside it together." It was a truth none of us could ignore. Attempts to draw them into ordinary life had failed. To separate them was to kill them by degrees. Reunited, they thrived, but only within the walls of their own creation. The question that haunted me as I left that day was not whether they could be saved, but whether they wished to be. They had chosen their world, and for anyone else who tried to enter, there was no door. It was in the winter of that year when I began to notice a rhythm beneath their strange duet, a hidden current that pulled one forward while forcing the other back. It was not immediately clear when one first beheld June and Jennifer. They seemed equal in their silence, equal in their secrecy. But as the weeks of observation lengthened, I began to see the subtle signs. June would lean slightly, her head tilted deferentially toward her sister, as though waiting for permission to breathe. Jennifer, in contrast, carried herself with a force that filled the room, even without a word directed at anyone but June. She did not merely speak in their secret tongue, she commanded it, setting the tempo, dictating when the phrases began and when they ended. When I reviewed their journals, lent reluctantly by the counselor who had discovered them, the pattern emerged with even greater clarity. The entries were shockingly articulate for girls who outwardly refused to engage with the written word. They wove strange stories, tales of betrayal and resurrection, of sisters locked in battles that ended with one triumphant and the other fading into the dust. Some pages were furious with crossed-out words, others neat and deliberate, as if they had been written for an audience that would never exist. One entry from Jennifer struck me most of all. It was scrawled in a hurried hand, lines pressed deep into the paper. She must die, and then I will live. Without her, I can be free. Without her, I can speak. I can breathe. The chilling certainty of those words left me sleepless for nights. In another journal, June's tone was altogether different. There was resignation there, a weary kind of surrender. She is stronger. She tells me what to do. Sometimes I hate her. Sometimes I think I will stop breathing so she can go on. It is the only way. It was then that I realized the depth of the entanglement between them. Their silence was not merely a refusal, it was a fortress, built from years of shared captivity within one another. Yet inside that fortress, one was jailer, and the other prisoner. They were not equals. They were bound in a pact spoken or unspoken that only one could ultimately endure. I began to watch their movements with new eyes. In small gestures, I saw it again. The way Jennifer's glance could freeze June into stillness. The way June's laughter only emerged if Jennifer first permitted a smile. Their games, their stories, their entire world was shaped by this dominance and submission, a cruel choreography they both seemed to accept. The thought of such young girls carrying within them the seed of annihilation was almost unbearable. I spoke with their teachers, their parents, even Hugh's, but none seemed willing to confront the possibility. They're only girls, Gloria insisted. Sisters quarrel, sisters fight. They'll grow out of it. Yet the writings told a different truth, darker than mere sibling rivalry. These were not idle threats or childish fantasies. They were premonitions, carefully recorded, rehearsed like a play, destined for performance. One evening, after hours spent poring over their journals, I closed my notebook and sat in silence. The wind rattled against the panes of my rented room in Haverfordwest, and I could hear, faintly, the echo of their laughter carried from the house across the street. It struck me then that I was not merely observing a medical curiosity, not simply chronicling the behavior of two difficult children. I was bearing witness to a tragedy already written, the outline of which had been sketched in their own hands. The question that haunted me was not whether one of them would die, but whether they had already decided who it must be. Their pact, buried in ink and silence, seemed less a possibility than an inevitability. And I, an outsider peering into their world, could do nothing but watch as the balance tipped slowly, inexorably, toward sacrifice. Adolescence descended upon the girls, not with the awkward clumsiness of ordinary teenagers, but with a violence that seemed almost fated. Their silence, once merely peculiar, began to carry a charge, a kind of menace that unsettled the adults who still tried to reach them. It was no longer the shy retreat of children overwhelmed by the world. It had hardened into defiance, into something sharp and deliberate. When they passed through the streets of Haverfordwest, they did so as shadows, walking side by side, identical steps falling in perfect rhythm, their eyes fixed straight ahead. People muttered as they went by, saying the twins brought a chill with them, that they carried storms in their silence. Teachers spoke of books torn and thrown from shelves, of sudden bursts of laughter in their secret tongue, the sound like incantations in empty classrooms. Shopkeepers whispered of items gone missing, small things at first sweets, magazines, bottles of nail varnish, but soon the thefts grew bolder. Purses lifted, records tucked under coats, entire cartons of cigarettes vanished without a word exchanged. They were rarely caught in the act, yet suspicion gathered around them like mist, and in their wake lingered the acrid scent of unease. Then came the fires. It began, as so many dark stories do, with curiosity. The younger children had reported seeing June and Jennifer crouched together at the edge of the playing fields, striking matches they had stolen from their father's drawer. The flames were small then, hurriedly snuffed out, leaving only smoldering patches of grass and the faint glow of excitement in their eyes. But soon the fascination grew. They set fire to newspapers, then to piles of leaves, then to an abandoned shed at the edge of the estate. One night, I was called by Hughes, who had grown increasingly alarmed. He spoke in a hushed voice, as though fearing the twins might overhear even from miles away. A building had gone up in flames on Milford Road, an old and unused shop that burned so quickly the fire brigade could not save even its frame. The twins were seen standing across the street, watching, silent, unmoving, as if the blaze were not destruction, but ceremony. In their diaries, the fascination with fire was written plain. Jennifer described flames as the only thing that speaks for us, while June wrote of the thrill in watching the world catch our breath and burn. They seemed to believe fire carried something of themselves outward into the world, a translation of their silence into raw destruction. If they would not speak, then the crackle of flames would speak for them. I visited them not long after, and their stillness felt charged in a way that unsettled me more than anything before. They sat side by side, eyes glimmering with an intensity I could not penetrate, lips sealed, save for an occasional murmur of their strange, rapid tongue. I could not shake the sense that words, should they be uttered aloud, might unleash something neither they nor I could contain. Their silence had become less a defense and more a weapon, a force that held power over every room they entered. The community grew afraid of them, whispering that the twins carried ruin wherever they went. Parents crossed the street, children hurried past, priests muttered prayers when they caught their gaze. Yet the girls, still bound only to one another, seemed indifferent. They walked in step, whispered in code, and left behind a trail of scorch marks on walls and pavements. By the time authorities began to intervene, their reputation was sealed. June and Jennifer were no longer merely the silent twins. They had become something darker, an omen, a warning. A story mothers told their children in hushed voices as the wind rattled across the slate roofs of Haverfordwest. And still, behind their silence, I felt the heat of an unspoken truth, that their destruction was not wild chaos, but the execution of a pact, burning its way towards some terrible fulfillment. I remember the first time I sat across from Dr. Llewellyn Morgan, the psychiatrist summoned by the authorities when the twins' mischief spilled past petty crime into the realm of danger. He was a tall, hollow-faced man with a mane of iron-gray hair and eyes that had seen too many wards, too many ruined lives. We met in his study in Cardiff, the fire snapping in the grate, shelves lined with leather-bound volumes on psychiatry, anthropology, and the occult. He had the air of a man not easily impressed, yet his expression when he spoke of June and Jennifer was tinged with something like awe, edged with fear. "You must understand," he said, after I recounted my observations, the silence, the fire, the language, like no language. "This is not mere mutism. It is not simple refusal, nor shyness, nor the defensive withdrawal one sees in traumatized children. What you are witnessing is a closed system, a psychic fortress." His voice dropped as he leaned forward. "And such fortresses are not built without reason." I pressed him, asking what he meant. He folded his hands, staring into the fire as though it might arrange his thoughts into words. "Twins often form private languages in early childhood, cryptophagia we call it. Usually it fades as they grow, a scaffold abandoned once real words take hold. But in these girls, the scaffold has become the structure itself. They live inside it. The language is not a supplement to English, it is their world entire. To them, we are the ones speaking nonsense." I thought of the rapid, rolling syllables I had recorded, the way their eyes lit when they spoke it, and felt a shiver run through me. "But surely," I said, "with therapy, with careful guidance, the walls can be dismantled?" His gaze shifted to me, grave and unblinking. "You may dismantle the walls, yes, but what if the walls are the only thing holding them together? Break the system, and you risk breaking them." He paused, weighing his words. "I have seen such cases before, though never so extreme. When you separate twins bound in this way, they do not simply pine, they collapse. They lose appetite, will, breath. As though one body has been cleaved in two, and neither half can remember how to survive alone." I told him of the failed intervention, of the girls wasting away when sent to different schools, of the miraculous recovery when reunited. He nodded, as if this confirmed his darkest suspicion. Precisely. You may think you are liberating them from silence, but in truth, you may be killing them by degrees. Their pact is stronger than our medicine, stronger than law, stronger even than blood. You cannot treat them as individuals, because they do not exist as individuals. They exist only as a pair. I sat back, unsettled, unsure whether his words were wisdom or resignation. There was something almost mystical in the way he spoke, as though the twins had ceased to be psychiatric patients and become creatures of legend, bound by rules no textbook could chart. When I left his house, the wind off the Severn was sharp, needling my face. His words echoed in my mind, repeating with the rhythm of a warning bell. A psychic fortress, a closed system, break it, and you risk breaking them. For the first time, I wondered if our very presence, the probing questions, the whispered analyses, the endless attempts to pull them into our world, was less an act of healing than of intrusion. And if that were true, then perhaps the most dangerous force the twins faced was not the fires they set, nor the silence they kept, but us. Pressing at the gates of a fortress we could neither enter nor destroy, without bringing the whole strange structure down upon their heads. It was with a sense of foreboding that I first passed through the gates of Broadmoor, the sprawling high-security hospital that loomed like a citadel for the broken and the dangerous. Even the name carried a chill. Broadmoor, whispered like a curse, a place reserved for those society had deemed untouchable. I had read about it in medical journals, seen grainy photographs of its stone walls, but nothing could have prepared me for the oppressive weight of the place. The air was heavy with disinfectant and the metallic tang of keys, doors, locks. The silence in its corridors was not silence at all, but a suffocating hum of restraint. June and Jennifer had been sent here after their fires and their thefts, their quiet rebellion finally earning the kind of attention no one had wanted for them. The court deemed them dangerous, though they had harmed no one but themselves. Still, they were bundled into this fortress of the disturbed, this labyrinth of long corridors and watchful eyes. When I first saw them there, seated side by side in a stark day room, they looked less like patients and more like museum pieces, two strange artifacts behind glass for staff to gawk at when the monotony of their shifts threatened to overwhelm them. The attendants, though not unkind, carried themselves with a detached curiosity. They whispered of the girls as the silent ones, as if they were exotic creatures rather than young women with beating hearts. Some of the nurses confessed to trying to coax a word from them, offering sweets, coaxing smiles, anything to provoke a reaction. But the twins sat mute, their backs pressed so close they seemed fused, their gaze always darting to one another rather than the world around them. I felt a tight knot of anger watching this and indignation I could not voice without jeopardizing my access to them. The hospital's routines were unrelenting. Medication lines, group sessions, locked doors, head counts. I watched June and Jennifer shuffle through these rituals with an air of distant compliance, never resisting, never participating. It was as though they understood that the world outside their fortress had grown too strong to resist, and now they chose to retreat deeper into themselves. Their language, that rapid-fire cascade of syllables, I heard only once in those halls. It erupted suddenly. A sharp volley of words passed between them when a nurse touched Jennifer's arm to guide her into line. The sound was electric, startling even the other patients. The nurse frowned and muttered about nonsense babble, but I recognized the cadence, the same secret tongue that had once filled their small bedroom in Haverfordwest. In Broadmoor, it was an act of defiance, a reminder that their fortress still stood intact. What horrified me most was the way the institution swallowed their humanity. Here, patients were files, charts, symptoms, risks. June and Jennifer were listed not as children of a working-class family, not as daughters or sisters, but as twin female, elective mute, arson risk. They were stripped to their strangeness, categorized into neat clinical boxes. I remember leaving the ward that day and feeling my throat tighten, as if I had swallowed the institution's coldness whole. Outside, the rain lashed the stone walls, a reminder that Wales was far away, that their childhood moors and whispered games were lost behind these locked doors. I wondered then if Broadmoor had been chosen not as a treatment, but as a burial ground for their differency, a place where the world could forget them. Confident they were being managed. And as I walked back to the car park, the echo of their syllables clinging to me like damp clothes, I could not shake the terrible suspicion that the walls of Broadmoor would not heal them, but calcify the silence forever, until the world could claim victory by their obliteration. Would you like me to continue this Broadmoor arc in the next chapter, with a stronger sense of dread showing how their diaries grew darker within those walls? It was in the antiseptic stillness of Broadmoor's observation room that I first noticed the true extent of their mirroring. At first, I assumed it was coincidence, a shared habit, a twin's mimicry born of long familiarity. But the more I watched, the more I realized this was not mere imitation. It was something ritualistic, deliberate, almost sacred. They sat across from me at a plain wooden table, their wrists resting on the surface like two halves of the same image. When June raised her hand to brush an imaginary strand of hair from her forehead, Jennifer's hand rose in the same instant, brushing at nothing, the gesture so perfectly synchronized that it seemed rehearsed. A second later, their fingers fell back onto the table in unison, the sound of 4 fingertips striking wood at once, like the punctuation of an unspoken sentence. Their eyes followed the same invisible path, gaze lifting to the corner of the ceiling, then dropping to their hands, then darting sideways at me, each movement mirrored with uncanny precision. When I tried to engage one, speaking softly, leaning forward, the other leaned forward too, with the same fractional angle of the head tilt. It was like addressing a reflection in glass, but with 2 breathing bodies before me. I began to test it. If I asked Jennifer a question, June's lips parted at the same time, though no words emerged. If I shifted my chair, they both blinked together. A slow closing and opening of the eyelids as though resetting the frame. Once, a nurse dropped a clipboard in the hall, and the sound startled them. They jerked in perfect tandem, shoulders tightening, mouths tightening into a near smile, then relaxing back into stillness, as though choreographed by the same nervous system. At night, the staff reported, they lay on adjacent beds in their cell-like room, breathing in unison, rolling over at the same instant, even falling asleep with their hands folded identically across their chests. One attendant swore he had seen them blink in unison for a full hour, as though bound to the same internal metronome. The nurses whispered among themselves, unsettled, muttering about possession or madness. I found myself equally disturbed, though for different reasons. It was not madness I saw, but a binding pact, 2 wills soldered together so completely that individuality had been sacrificed at the altar of their secret bond. There was no spontaneity between them. If Jennifer coughed, June coughed seconds later, even if the first had been genuine and the second clearly forced. If June scratched her arm, Jennifer's nails followed across her own skin, drawing invisible maps of symmetry. The air between them crackled with it, a compulsion stronger than habit, as if breaking the mirror would shatter them both. I thought of the psychiatrist's warning, a psychic fortress, but what I witnessed seemed deeper still. This was not merely a fortress of silence, but a religion of duplication, each movement an act of devotion to the other. To live was to mirror, to breathe was to echo. I wondered then if they feared that any divergence would unravel their unity, expose them to the cruel world that had never understood them. Leaving the ward that evening, I carried with me the image of their hands on the table, fingers twitching in synchrony, 4 digits moving as one. It haunted me, because it was beautiful and horrifying all at once, a bond so complete, it obliterated the self. And I could not decide whether I had just witnessed the purest form of love, or the most exquisite form of imprisonment. Would you like me to continue next with the chapter where their diaries in Broadmoor begin to reveal the deep rivalry behind this perfect symmetry? The journals came to me through a nurse who had grown uneasy. She had found one tucked beneath the thin hospital mattress, its cover worn from nervous fingers, its pages inked with a hurried hand. I opened it late at night in my rented room, the faint hum of the radiator filling the silence, and found myself staring into a mind that spoke with devastating clarity. The words were Jennifer Sherloop's of handwriting distinctive, her tone heavier, almost martial in its insistence. She wrote of the exhaustion of being two, of the crushing need to dominate, and the unbearable guilt of succeeding. She spoke of June as though she were both beloved sister and mortal enemy, a shadow chained to her ankles. Buried halfway through the book was a single sentence that froze me. "We have agreed that one must give way." The words stood apart, isolated on the page, as though even Jennifer feared their power. She did not elaborate immediately, but in the entries that followed there were hints, murmurs of an arrangement not unlike a covenant. Phrases surfaced like dark fish in a still pond. "I must die that she may live. Freedom comes only when the other is gone. It is our pact." I set the journal down, chilled to my core. These were not the fantasies of violent youth scribbled in a fever. These were negotiations cold, deliberate, almost contractual. I had studied pathological bonds, psychogenic illnesses, the shared madness of pairs, but this was different. This was an erasure planned from within, a ritual of self-destruction framed as liberation. When I next saw them, I could not help but scrutinize their every glance. June's eyes seemed softer, almost pleading, while Jennifer's were hard, bright, with something approaching resolve. They sat side by side, their hands folded identically in their laps, but the silence between them pulsed with the weight of the unspoken. It was no longer the easy quiet of a secret language. It was the hush of a negotiation concluded, a verdict rendered, but not yet carried out. I tried, carefully, to press. I asked if they believed one day they might live apart, each with her own life, her own voice. Jennifer's lips twitched in what could have been the ghost of a smile, but she did not answer. June lowered her gaze, as though even hearing the question was unbearable. Their shoulders lifted and fell at the same instant. A single breath split across two chests, and then they sank back into their silence. Later that evening, I found June's smaller notebook, her script hesitant, dotted with blots as though written in trembling secrecy. In it, she confessed a terror of Jennifer's strength, a fear that she was being consumed by her sister's will. "She is the stronger," June wrote. "She will decide. I must follow. I must." Her tone was not one of rebellion but of resignation, as if she had already surrendered her fate. As I read, my unease hardened into dread. These were not the mutterings of madness, they were the architecture of sacrifice. I was not watching a case of mutism, nor even of psychosis. I was watching a slow, silent bargain in which death had become the currency of freedom. That night I lay awake listening to the wind clawing at the panes, unable to rid myself of the image of them sitting side by side, breathing as one, yet already imagining the world when only one breath remained. It was then I understood the psychiatrist's warning in its darkest light. This was not about curing them, or teaching them to speak, or unbinding them from silence. It was about survival, and survival, in their eyes, required the deliberate extinction of one half of the whole. Would you like me to continue next with the chapter where the tension of this pact begins to manifest in their escalating behavior inside Broadmoor? It began almost imperceptibly. At first, the nurses said Jennifer was simply tired, that she slept more than June, that perhaps the endless routine of Broadmoor had dulled her into torpor. But within weeks the change could not be ignored. When I visited, I found her sitting in the day room, her head drooping forward, strands of hair falling across her face, her hands limp in her lap as though drained of any vitality. Her body seemed to carry the heaviness of stone. When she did rise, she shuffled rather than walked, each movement halting, mechanical, as though her limbs no longer belonged to her. The staff began to worry. Trays of untouched food returned from her room. At mealtimes, she pushed her plate away, lips pressed shut with the stubborn finality of a condemned prisoner refusing a last meal. No coaxing helped, no threats, no bribes. Liquid she accepted only reluctantly, a few sips at best. Doctors ran their tests, blood work, examinations, all the clinical rituals of their trade, but nothing yielded an answer. Her body, by their account, was healthy. No infection, no disease, no measurable reason for the collapse. Yet Jennifer withered before our eyes, her cheeks hollowing, her skin paling to a wan gray. June remained beside her, as always. She did not eat much more herself, but enough to sustain her. She watched Jennifer with eyes that seemed older than her years, eyes that did not widen in alarm but narrowed in a kind of grim acceptance, as though she had long anticipated this slow decline. When asked if she was worried, June would only murmur a phrase in their secret tongue, a sound sharp and rhythmic, and Jennifer would stir faintly, almost approvingly, before sinking back into her stupor. The journals reflected the same trajectory. Jennifer's entries grew shorter, her hand sloppier, until at last there were only single sentences written with the finality of epitaphs. It is decided. Soon. I am already gone. June's writings, discovered in another small book, were no less haunting. She must go, and I must stay. One line read. It is the only way. I felt as though I were reading the minutes of some invisible court, judgments handed down not by doctors or judges but by the twins themselves. I confronted the medical staff, asking if they considered the possibility that Jennifer's decline was voluntary, even willed. Some dismissed me with the tired wave of a hand patient's refuse food all the time, they said. Others leaned closer, lowering their voices, and admitted they had never seen anything quite like it. It's as though she's shutting off, one nurse whispered to me. Not dying, exactly just, stepping aside. The sight of them together became unbearable. June would sit upright, her posture stiff, her gaze forward, while Jennifer leaned against her shoulder, eyes half closed, breathing shallow. They seemed not like sisters, but like a queen and her shadow, one receding as the other, prepared to take the throne of singular existence. Each visit left me rattled, convinced I was witnessing not an illness but a ritual enacted in flesh. Jennifer was making good on the pact, carrying out the silent negotiation in the only way possible by fading, inch by inch, until absence itself became her final word. And June, whether horrified or complicit, did nothing to stop her. She only waited, patient, as though the whole of her freedom depended on her sister's collapse. I left Broadmoor one evening under a sky the color of lead, the wind whipping hard against the stone walls, and could not rid myself of the feeling that Jennifer was not merely ill but already rehearsing her departure. It was not medicine that would decide her fate, nor intervention. It was will, sharpened into a blade turned inward, and I, powerless, could only watch as the blade slowly cut away her presence from this world. Would you like me to continue with the chapter where Jennifer's death finally arrives, carrying the dreadful sense of inevitability that has been building since their pact? The decision came suddenly, as if some unseen hand had loosened the lock that kept them bound within Broadmoor's grim walls. After years of confinement, the authorities approved their transfer to a lower security hospital. It was presented as a mercy, a recognition that their crimes of fire and silence no longer warranted such severe imprisonment. But to those who knew them, it felt less like liberation and more like the shifting of pawns on a board whose rules had been written long before. The staff spoke of progress, of rehabilitation, of a gentler environment awaiting them. Yet the air among those who worked closest with the twins was not celebratory. It carried a tension, a dread that no one wished to articulate aloud. On the morning of the journey, the sky was a pale wash of gray, the sun diffused into a blur behind thin clouds. The bus that arrived was not the hulking prison van of earlier transports but a smaller vehicle, unmarked, with seats arranged in rows like any ordinary coach. The illusion of normalcy made the moment even more unsettling. June and Jennifer were dressed identically, as always. Long coats buttoned high, hair parted in the same way, shoes polished as though for a funeral. Their faces betrayed little, but their bodies seemed rigid, alert, tuned to some private frequency. I sat near the front, permitted to accompany them, and could feel the weight of their silence pressing against the confined air. The road stretched out in long, meandering lines through the Welsh countryside, hedgerows flashing past the windows in blurred green and brown. For a long while, there was nothing but the hum of the engine and the occasional cough of the driver. Then, almost imperceptibly, I heard it a whisper. Jennifer had leaned close to her sister, her lips barely moving, her voice so faint it might have been the rustle of fabric. Yet, I caught the words, or thought I did. "I'm going to die," she breathed. "It's my turn." The phrase struck me with the cold weight of prophecy. June did not recoil, did not protest. She gave a slow nod, her eyes fixed forward, and in that moment the air between them became electric. It was not surprise she showed, nor grief, but acknowledgement, as though the long bargain of their lives had reached its final clause. I watched their hands folded neatly in their laps and noticed how Jennifer's fingers trembled while June's remained steady, almost too steady. The rest of the journey unfolded in a haze. I tried to tell myself I had misheard, that Jennifer's words were only the fevered imagination of a man too long steeped in their strange world. Yet the conviction in her tone lingered, unmistakable, and I could not shake the feeling that I had witnessed the sealing of a pact spoken in whispers between sisters who had lived more in silence than in speech. Jennifer slumped lower in her seat as the miles passed, her eyelids fluttering, her lips pale. June sat upright, her profile stern, her chin slightly raised as though bracing herself for what was to come. Their shoulders touched lightly, but the contact felt charged, symbolic, like the passing of something invisible from one body into the other. When the bus finally pulled into the grounds of the new facility, the staff bustled with paperwork and orders, oblivious to the gravity of what had just transpired. To them, this was a simple transfer. Another day, another pair of patients moved along the chain. But to me, the atmosphere inside that small vehicle was unmistakable. Jennifer had spoken her fate aloud, had given it shape with words, and in doing so, had set it into motion. As we disembarked, June walked first, her steps unnervingly calm. Jennifer followed, but there was a dragging to her gait, as though each step cost her more than the last. Her eyes found mine for a fleeting instant, and in them I saw neither fear nor pleading, but the strange serenity of someone who has chosen their own vanishing. I turned away, unable to bear the weight of her gaze, the certainty it carried. The world outside went on as before, clouds drifting, crows circling above the trees, the low hum of cars on a distant road, but for me, and for them, everything had shifted. The journey was not merely one of geography, from one hospital to another. It was a passage into something irreversible, a crossing into a space where one twin would remain, and the other would not. Would you like me to continue with the next chapter, where Jennifer's whispered prophecy fulfills itself almost immediately upon arrival? The bus rolled to a slow halt in the gravel lot, the sound of crunching stones under the tires echoing in the morning stillness. Staff moved briskly, clipboards in hand, ready to receive their unusual new patients. For a moment, everything appeared orderly, routine, as though this transfer were no different from a dozen others. But then, as the twins stepped down from the bus, the air itself seemed to shift. June moved first, her posture unnervingly straight, eyes fixed on some distant horizon. Behind her, Jennifer descended carefully, her steps uncertain, as though she were walking not into a building but into the very threshold of departure. She swayed as her shoes touched the ground, one hand brushing against the bus for balance. A guard reached instinctively to steady her, but before his hand could meet her arm, her body folded in on itself. She crumpled to the pavement without a cry, without resistance, as though her bones had dissolved in an instant. The silence that followed was absolute. June froze where she stood, her back rigid, her hands clenched into fists at her sides, and then, slowly, she turned to look down at her sister. Her expression was unreadable in either panic nor shock, but something quieter, heavier, as though she had been expecting this moment all along. Chaos erupted around them. Staff shouted for a medic. Someone sprinted toward the main building to fetch a crash cart. A nurse dropped to her knees beside Jennifer, calling her name again and again, pressing 2 fingers against her neck, listening for breath, finding nothing. Orders, flu compressions, oxygen, adrenaline, but the body on the ground resisted all efforts, as though it had already slipped beyond reach. Her chest did not rise, her eyes remained closed, and the faint flush of color that had always marked her cheeks faded into a pallor that made her look like a wax figure left in the cold. I stood frozen a few steps away, my notebook still clutched in my hand, my throat dry with disbelief. Only an hour before, on the bus, she had whispered her intent. I'm going to die. It's my turn. Now those words returned with brutal clarity. There had been no violence, no struggle, no convulsion. It was as if she had simply willed her body to shut itself down, as though some hidden switch within her heart had been flicked. The official procedures unfolded with mechanical efficiency. Jennifer was lifted onto a stretcher, wheeled inside, monitored, prodded, declared gone. Later, after the sterile rituals of examination and autopsy, the doctors could provide only the vaguest explanation. They found sudden inflammation of the heart, myocarditis without cause, no trace of infection, no poison, no trauma. It was the kind of finding that satisfied no one. To the clinicians, it was an anomaly, a puzzle piece without edges. To those who had watched the twins for years, it was something else entirely, the manifestation of a pact too deep for medicine to name. June sat alone in a waiting room chair while the body was tended to, her face impassive, her gaze fixed on her lap. No tears fell, no sobs escaped her throat. She sat in perfect stillness, the way she always had, except now the stillness felt different. It was not the silence of refusal or defiance, but of release. When a nurse tried to comfort her, she only shook her head faintly, as if words were unnecessary. She had understood before any of us what was happening. She had been prepared. I could not stop thinking of the phrase that had haunted me since the bus ride. It's my turn. It sounded less like resignation and more like fulfillment, the completion of an order long established between them. The autopsy might call it unexplained inflammation, but in truth, it was the sealing of a covenant, carried out not with hands or blades, but with the sheer force of shared will. Jennifer had chosen, or had been chosen, and June had let her go. When the report was filed, the language was cold, detached. Sudden cardiac death, idiopathic, unpreventable. Yet, I could still see her collapsing in silence, could still feel the chill that entered the air when her body touched the ground. It was not a medical event, it was an act of surrender. That night, as I sat in my rented room near the hospital, I found myself staring at my notes without reading them, hearing again the faint whisper that had started it all. I realized I had witnessed something I could not explain, not in clinical terms, not in the language of psychiatry or pathology. The pact had been honored, and now June remained alone, but free. Would you like me to continue into the next chapter, where June begins to speak for the first time after Jennifer's death? The morning after Jennifer's death, the hospital corridors held a different kind of quiet, not the institutional hum of fluorescent lights and rubber soles, but a silence sharpened by absence. Word had spread quickly among the staff. One of the infamous silent twins had died without cause, collapsing in the open air as if life had simply slipped away. Nurses whispered about it in the break room, orderlies lingered by the stairwells, and even the doctors moved with an uncharacteristic hesitation, as though they were all carrying the weight of a mystery too fragile to name. I returned to the ward expecting June to be as she had always been, motionless, mute, sealed behind the fortress of her own silence. Instead, when I stepped into the small, stark room where she sat, she lifted her head and looked directly at me. For years, Those eyes had seemed fixed on some unreachable interior world, but now they fastened on mine with startling clarity. Her lips parted. Her voice steady, resonant, perfectly clear merged into the air. "We shared everything," she said. The sound of her words froze me in place. They were not halting or broken, not the stuttering efforts of someone unused to speech. They flowed smoothly, like a current that had always existed beneath the surface, hidden but waiting. The nurse beside me gasped audibly, nearly dropping the clipboard in her hands. I moved closer, my breath shallow. "Say it again," I murmured, as though afraid that speaking too loudly might shatter the moment. June did not hesitate. Her next words fell with precise conviction, spoken as though rehearsed for years. "But now she has given me freedom." The room seemed to tilt. Behind me, a doctor entered, summoned quickly by the nurse's call, and he stopped dead when he heard her voice. For decades, experts had tried everything: speech therapy, separation, psychiatric intervention, and all had failed. Yet now, in the aftermath of her sister's inexplicable death, June spoke fluently, without coaxing, without fear. She went on, her voice even, her accent, a strange blend of influences, her phrasing careful yet natural. She spoke of her childhood, of the silence they had woven like a cocoon, of the pact made in shadows. "We decided long ago," she confessed, "that one of us must give way. There was not enough life for both of us to live it freely." She knew. She always knew. Doctors gathered quickly, filling the doorway, recording every word. Their clinical detachment faltered in the face of what they were witnessing. Some stared in awe, others scribbled frantically in notebooks, desperate to capture the exact phrasing. But for me, standing only feet away, the words did not feel like a medical breakthrough or the resolution of a case study. They felt like revelation, as though the silence itself had been a ritual, and I was witnessing its final act. June spoke for nearly an hour that first morning. She answered questions without hesitation, describing feelings, memories, even hopes. She recalled the night she and Jennifer had written of their secret pact, how they tested each other's resolve, how she had known for weeks that Jennifer was preparing to surrender. "It was her gift," she said, with a calmness that was almost chilling. "She gave me the space to breathe, to speak, to live." When she paused, there was no tremor in her expression, no tears. The staff leaned forward, as though waiting for her to collapse back into muteness, but she did not. Her words were steady, her presence strangely commanding. What unsettled me most was not only the fluency of her speech but the sense of authority in her tone, as though she had crossed some invisible threshold. It was not the voice of a fragile patient emerging from illness. It was the voice of someone newly sovereign, released from a prison built for two. That night, as I wrote my notes, I found my hand trembling. I could still hear her voice, echoing against the sterile walls. "We shared everything. But now she has given me freedom." It was a confession and an absolution, a statement so simple and yet so vast that it defied interpretation. Medicine could not explain why Jennifer's heart had stopped, nor why June had suddenly found her own. But I understood, in a way that frightened me, that this was the conclusion of a ritual enacted not in words but in silence, a ritual now fulfilled. June's voice did not falter in the days that followed. She spoke as though she had been waiting all her life for this moment. Yet behind every phrase lingered the absence of the other, the shadow that would never speak again. Freedom had come at a terrible cost, and as I listened, I could not shake the feeling that her words carried not only relief, but the weight of a sacrifice no one else could ever repay. "Do you want me to continue into the next chapter, where June begins to step into the world alone for the first time, navigating life without Jennifer?" The cemetery in Haverfordwest lay quiet under a pale sky, the kind of overcast Welsh morning that softened the edges of everything. Mist clung low to the ground, settling on the worn stones and the rusted iron gates. I had not expected the place to feel so small, so tucked away, as though the town had hidden its dead in a corner where the living rarely dared to linger. The grass was damp beneath my shoes, and the only sound was the distant call of a crow perched on a crooked cross. I followed June along the narrow path, my heart heavy with the weight of what we had come to do. Jennifer's grave was freshly turned, the soil still raw and darker than the surrounding earth. There was no elaborate headstone, only a modest marker with her name etched in stark letters, the dates of her birth and death set close together, almost mocking the brevity of her life. For a moment, I felt a strange dissonance. Here lay a girl who had terrified teachers, confounded doctors, and haunted my own thoughts for years. Now she was reduced to a name on a stone, indistinguishable from the hundreds of other lives resting quietly around her. June moved ahead of me, carrying a small bundle of flowers. They were not extravagant blooms, just a modest collection of wildflowers bound with a fraying ribbon, their colors dulled by the morning air. She knelt by the grave, her movements deliberate, as though rehearsed. The silence around us deepened, as though even the wind had stilled to watch. She laid the flowers gently against the soil, pressing them down as if anchoring them into the earth itself. Then she leaned forward, lips close to the marker, and whispered something. The words were impossible for me to catch, carried away too softly to reach my ears. It was their private tongue, the secret language the twins had guarded for years, the language that had bound them together in defiance of the world. Hearing the murmur of it now, after Jennifer's death and June's sudden liberation into speech, sent a chill through me. This was no slip back into silence but a deliberate invocation, a final communication meant for one listener only. Her whisper stretched longer than I expected, almost like a prayer, though I could not tell if it carried grief, farewell, or something darker. The cadence of it rose and fell, strange and lyrical, reminding me of the first time I had glimpsed their notebooks filled with cryptic scrawls. It was the sound of a world closed to outsiders, a final tether between two souls who had shared everything. I stood still, feeling like an intruder at a ritual not meant for my eyes. When she finished, June straightened slowly. She did not touch the stone again. She did not weep. She did not even pause. She rose to her feet and, without turning her head, began to walk back down the path. Her pace was steady, unhurried, as though she had completed an obligation and now carried no burden to linger. She never once looked back at the grave. I remained standing there, rooted to the spot, unable to follow at once. The flowers rested starkly against the soil, a fragile splash of color against the damp earth. The absence of June's backward glance unnerved me more than if she had broken down in tears. It was not indifference, I realized, but something colder finality. She had spoken her last words to her sister in that hidden tongue, and now she was finished. I looked again at Jennifer's name carved into the stone, the dash between birth and death, representing a life that had been more ritual than living. The soil seemed to pulse with the memory of their pact, their strange and terrible bond. June's footsteps grew fainter behind me, until I could hear them no more, and I understood then that she had severed the cord in that moment of whispered farewell. As I turned to follow her, the mist thickened, closing around the graveyard, as though the earth itself was reclaiming what belonged to it. Jennifer was gone. June had chosen not to look back. And I, caught between the living and the dead, could not decide which of them seemed more haunting. Would you like me to write the next chapter where June begins life on her own, confronting the world without her twin's shadow for the first time? I find myself, in these late years, returning again and again to the question that has never left me. The twins' story has long since passed into the realm of curiosity, their names spoken only by those who dig into the annals of psychiatric oddities or who chase after the fringes of folklore and myth. To most, they are a closed case, a strange episode resolved by the finality of a grave, but for me, they remain a wound that never fully closes. Time has blurred many things faces of colleagues, the particulars of hospitals I once visited, even the exact shade of the Welsh sky on the day of Jennifer's burial. And yet the sound of their voices, the murmuring in that hidden tongue, has not faded. It lingers as vividly as if they were still whispering just beyond my shoulder. I have asked myself endlessly, was their language merely a game? Two clever children, inventing a code out of stubborn refusal to engage with a world that did not want them? That would be the simplest explanation, the one that comforts professionals and laymen alike. Children invent secret languages. Twins, in particular, are notorious for it. But no child's game I have ever encountered had the density, the structure, the rhythm theirs did. I remember listening to recordings of them, two streams of sound intertwining with such synchronicity that it seemed less like improvisation and more like a liturgy. The cadences matched, the pauses fell in unison, and when I slowed the tapes, the words aligned in patterns that felt designed, deliberate, rehearsed beyond ordinary human memory. And then there is the other question, the darker one. Did Jennifer's death come because of choice? Because of the pact they once hinted at in their writings that one must die for the other to live? Doctors could never locate a physical cause, beyond the vague inflammation of the heart. No poison, no trauma, no disease. I have turned this over in my mind countless times. Could her body truly have obeyed her will, shutting itself down in perfect compliance with some hidden agreement? Psychosomatic death is not unknown, though rare grief alone has killed many. But what I saw in Jennifer's final weeks was not grief. It was resolution. She had decided. And once the decision was made, her body followed without resistance. Still, sometimes in the solitude of night, when the house is quiet and the recordings sit waiting on the desk, another possibility creeps in, one I am almost ashamed to articulate. Perhaps it was not choice at all. Perhaps it was not even the workings of the human mind in extremis. What if there was something elsey, force neither psychological nor physical, but something stranger, something that demanded balance? Two lives intertwined so completely that the release of one required the sacrifice of the other. The universe, in its inscrutable arithmetic, may have tallied them as one, not two, and decreed that freedom for June meant obliteration for Jennifer. I keep their recordings still, though many times I considered destroying them. They are stored on brittle tapes, their reels fragile with age. When I play them, the hiss of static fills the room, and then the voices begin. Always hushed, always close, overlapping, weaving in and out of one another like strands of music. At times they sound like ordinary speech, if only I could understand the words. But at other times, more often now, or perhaps it is only my aging mind, they sound like something else, a chant, an incantation. Less like language and more like invocation, as if they were not speaking to each other at all, but to something beyond, something that listened and answered in silence. When I hear those patterns late at night, I sometimes catch my breath, half afraid that the words will shape themselves into understanding, that I will suddenly know what they meant. Part of me longs for it, and part of me dreads it. For what if the understanding is not merely intellectual, but binding? What if to truly comprehend that private tongue is to step into the fortress they built, to inherit the pact they made? The question remains, and perhaps it always will. Were they children lost in invention, or did they glimpse and enter something stranger than the rest of us can imagine? I will go to my own grave not knowing. But I suspect that when I do, when the last breath leaves me, their voices will be waiting on the other side, whispering in that secret cadence, welcoming me into the mystery I have spent a lifetime failing to unravel. Would you like me to now expand this into a kind of epilogue where the narrator describes his final reflections on June's later life and what legacy the twins left behind?